Hey everyone, welcome to another Angry Artist podcast. Composition is something that every artwork has to have, but it's more of a subconscious thing. It's the layer that's keeping everything together, but not necessarily something that you always think about at all times. That's because composition is generally solved when you're doing thumbnails and sketches. And a lot of cases, your preferences of what a good composition is and what is a bad composition is different from everyone else's, depending on their influences and their favorite media. However, despite the fact that it's something that you kind of put on the side when you're drawing certain things, composition is everything. No matter how well you render something, let's say you're drawing a great character, I noticed there's a lot of artists who do not know how to frame them properly, and it kind of takes away from it. It's sort of like having a great cake, but you end up with a really bad icing. Even if the cake is fantastic, the icing will end up ruining it, and you end up with a bad piece of artwork. So, I want to give a brief explanation of what makes a good composition and what makes a bad composition. And really, quite simply, I want to put out there, while there are rules, it's not to be followed in every situation. So I'm sure people have heard of something like the rule of thirds. There's certain golden ratios when it comes to appealing compositions. While that is true, and in a lot of cases you can get away with just following the rules entirely, you will have to break them depending on the circumstances. Now, your artwork will have varying subject matters, and every piece is different. Everyone has their own mentality behind it. What happens is trying to force the rules onto your composition when everything is different and a lot of things have variables. You might get caught in the trap of following the rules too much or forcing the rules too much into what your subject matter is when it's not needed. So anyways, I want to start from the beginning of composition. What's the first thing that you have to think about? Very simple. The actual canvas. Every single canvas is different. You could even paint on circular canvases. That can work. However, no matter what you choose, a rectangular one, a square one, a circle, you have to think about the composition around that frame. It's sort of like you're giving your world one shot, one scene, and you want to put it in the best way possible. Now, the format depends on what you're trying to do. So, illustrations, if you're doing a book, then chances are you will have to do a rectangular or square composition. Of course, it gets very limited when you start doing, for example, TV or movie media. You are relegated to a rectangular composition that is 16 to 9 ratio or 4 to 3 ratio. You're talking about the older, not widescreen format. So that's the first key. You have to know what you're actually painting on. Now, once you have that, what's the second consideration? This is very obvious, and it's actually, again, subconscious, as I said before. It's the subject matter. What must be in your piece? Now, you can make tiers when it comes to these. So, for example, if you have to draw a character, then that is the highest tier of importance. Now, as you go down the list, you can use other elements that can balance the composition as you go along. However, it must be done in a reasonable manner. Now, a lot of people will find when you do a sketch or thumbnail and you transfer it to a painting, it starts to not work one to one. And I want to explain why. And it goes back to a previous video that I talked about before, and it's the idea of balance. When you have a sketch or a thumbnail, all you're most likely doing is having black lines and at most some values. When you add colors and when you start rendering details, you're creating new weight that a thumbnail and a sketch won't have. So what happens is you're going to have to rebalance your piece as you go along, and that again goes back to the subject matter. What is allowed to happen in your piece? So for instance, if you are painting a forest scene with an elven archer character, chances are, even if you want to put a giant mechanical monster on the side to balance the composition, you're probably going to have to think of something that will fit into the scene, of course. Now, that's not to say you can't do that. It will just look a little disjointed. So now that you have those considerations out of the way, what's the final consideration that you have to think about? It's harmony. Unification of the entire canvas. I always say, and something I've learned from a lot of professional artists, if you can cut out a part of the canvas, then chances are you are not using the canvas properly. You want to arrange things so that you make the best use of your canvas. And if you don't, it will start to look unbalanced. So what's the ultimate goal when it comes to the composition? Well, of course, it's to trap the viewer's eyes. No matter what media you're working on, you do not want your viewers to look at something else. And a lot of cases, you have to have subject matter that will lead your viewers back into the canvas. Now, I'll have to talk about those later. It's called vectoring. Sort of like having arrows that will point towards the canvas and keep your viewers within your artwork. Now, that's the technical side of the objectives. The subjective side is, of course, the message. I advise everyone to really study the best movies, the best artwork, and see how they show their subject matter. There's very distinct ways of composing your work that will sell the message. So I'll give you an example. If there is a very intimidating, gigantic person, how would you know if they're that intimidating or that big if you frame them very small on your canvas, proportional wise? So chances are, if you want to sell the idea that this guy is very dangerous and very big, he will most likely fill most of the canvas. Now, the subjective part is where I can't really teach much. There are stereotypes when it comes to composition, and there are, again, rules that you can follow. However, there are a myriad of ways to compose your artwork, and possibly infinite ways. Given that this is art, of course, everything is subjective. Everyone has their own preferences when it comes to how to show a certain message. It's sort of like having your favorite colors. Again, more subconscious when it comes to this, but nonetheless, everyone has their own way of saying things. It's language, basically, visual language. Anyways, hopefully that makes sense. I know there's a lot of things to talk about when it comes to art theory, so I'm trying my best to condense them to a 10-minute video. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.